A few years ago, I don't remember what television or radio guy it was, but he said, if you ever hear the phrase social justice in your church, leave that church. And, I was the pastor of New City. Everybody was going to leave. Because we talked about social justice all the time. And you know why we did that? Because God is a God of justice. That's why. And if justice has any play, it's always in society. So you can't talk about justice without talking about social justice. But if you bring that up, people think, you must be a Marxist. You must buy into that framework of life. And that is not only wrong, it's stupid. But that, I remember one time I spoke in chapel at Covenant, and I actually quoted Mao Zedong. And one of the professors grabbed me right after I was done. He said, "Why did you quote him?" And I said, actually, I've actually quoted the devil in church. I've quoted demons in church. To quote somebody doesn't mean you agree with them. And you know what? Even the devil tells the truth some of the time. So, what I'm trying to say, brothers and sisters, is that as we look at life, as we look at human conflict, we would be wrong to deny the common grace God has given to even non-Christians to be able to describe injustice in the world, to describe sin, to describe the fallenness of human nature. And we would be very parochial. We would be actually ignorant if we stayed in our little cocoon of Christianity and said, we don't want you to explain anything about the world to us because we got it all together. There's a problem with that. And one of the problems is, you see, some of what they describe as injustice has been in us, has been actually in the church. A few years ago, we were at General Assembly, and a couple of brothers from Mississippi rose up and said, "We've got some repenting to do." And they asked the General Assembly to please think and pray about repenting for some of the racism that helped to create the PCA. Some of the churches that originally began the PCA were churches that wanted nothing to do with integration. They were stalwarts of segregation, and they saw the liberal Presbyterians wanting to bring black folks into a white church. And they said, now a lot of them said, theologically, we don't like liberalism. Amen. But for some, it was more sociological than it was theological. I've actually preached in a church in South Carolina that told me, "We are so glad you're here today because, this church started when the first church downtown integrated. We stood up and walked out and came down here and built this church." But obviously, I wouldn't have been there if God hadn't changed their hearts. And so a few years ago, the General Assembly got together and said, we've got to deal with some of this racism among us in our founding. And the fact that we were shameful in our attitudes is not a cause for rejoicing, it was a cause for lament. But the fact that we lamented is a cause for rejoicing. And it brought hope. Just as our resolution some years before in confessing and repenting of racism brought hope to African Americans in our midst. It's a wonderful thing to face the truth and own up to it and admit it. You don't have to deny it. And one of the stupidest things we can do in an attempt to be peacemakers is to deny the truth. Thank you. Help me, somebody. Say amen if I say something true up here. Now look, what I'm trying to say is that we can't buy into a postmodern Marxist view of life but we can't deny it when they speak the truth. In fact, we have to say, yes, I agree with that, but you've made a mistake. To see all of life like that is pretty tribalistic. And this is, by the way, one of the great dangers of postmodernism. Postmodernism creates tribes, and it forces people into identification groups. And they begin to interpret all of life from their narrative. And they insist, you can't deny my narrative. Say, I'm not denying your narrative. I'm just denying your interpretation of it. And they say, well, how can you from the outside tell me if my truth is not truth? Because I've got a God's eye view of truth. That's the Bible. And this, brothers and sisters, is what makes the church different. Even though we have been tainted with the very sin that they accuse us of, we cannot surrender an interpretation of society, of culture, of race, to just simply a worldly, earthly perspective. Because once you reduce all of life to tribes, it's tribal competition, and that's one of the most dangerous things in the world. Now, black folk will tell you, well, hasn't that always been what's happening? Hasn't it always been white people wanting to dominate and rule the world and put every people down? Well, certainly there's an awful lot of evidence for that, but that's not all of life. Because there is this spiritual conflict. There is this fight for all of us as human beings against the devil and his works, against evil and injustice. We agree with critical race theory that there is such a thing as white privilege. Now, by the way, some of you may not like that idea. I grew up in the projects in a broken home on welfare in the city of Newark, New Jersey. It was called the worst city in America. I grew up in a very violent neighborhood. I grew up fighting. I cannot say that I grew up personally privileged. But personal privilege has nothing to do with white privilege. Because I don't get followed by storekeepers because of the color of my skin. I don't get pulled over by policemen because of the color of my skin. I get trusted because of the color of my skin. I'm a beneficiary of white privilege. It has nothing to do with my personal background. I get that. I can understand it, and I can understand the injustice of it.